Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight as part of our hypertension series of workshops. Tonight, we'll be doing the workshop on lifestyle modifications with Michelle Mattia. Just wanted to let you know that we still have 3 workshops left. On July 23rd, we'll be working with a pharmacist on pharmacology and hypertension. And then Dr. Mirza will join us again for some workshops in August 23rd and August 30th. One will be on the importance of the adherence to blood pressure therapy, and the last topic will be on urgencies and emergencies with hypertension. So please refer to the website to register for those as well. I wanted to remind you all, I have a couple documents that you'll need to turn in. One is the pre-diabetes checklist that is available online to be printed and returned. And the second is the program evaluation. So there's one of these for each of the programs or workshops that we're doing. This can actually be printed and returned, or you can complete it online. In either case, I will be notified, and as I collect this information, you earn a $5 First Town Downtown gift card for a maximum of $30 that will be sent to you at the conclusion of our workshops. So I certainly hope you will take advantage of those. Also wanted to remind you that if you have any difficulty having a home device for monitoring your blood pressure, I have those available and can work with you to give you one of those. So we've done a few of those, but I would certainly like to use all of the monitors that I have and get them out to you. All right, so again, thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Mattia. She's a registered dietitian and is joining us tonight to talk about lifestyle modifications. Michelle, thank you.
Thank you for that intro, Jenny. So we can start the slideshow. Perfect, thank you. So again, my name is Michelle Mattia. I am an exercise physiologist and a registered dietitian nutritionist. And today we're here to talk about the different factors related to lifestyle modification for reducing your risk for heart disease. So there's many factors that go into reducing our risk. So it's important to really establish our current situation and have that conversation. So being overweight or obese has a huge effect on our risk for heart disease and cardiovascular risk in general. So I won't read all of this word for word for you, but it's great to see these statistics that about 75% of adults are overweight or have obesity. Adults 40 to about 60 have the highest rate of obesity of any age group with adults, and 60 years and older having a 41% rate of obesity. And unfortunately, about 40% of children and adolescents are now overweight or have obesity, and the rate of obesity increases throughout life, starting in childhood. So getting right into cardiovascular disease risk. So we're looking primarily at hypertension, which we know is high blood pressure, high LDL and total blood cholesterol, and stroke, among some others like diabetes and other chronic disease. So we do know that heart disease is the leading cause of death, with about over 18 million adults having coronary artery disease, the most common type of heart disease. Stroke is the 5th leading cause of death, and we know that that is reduced blood flow to the brain, oftentimes due to plaque buildup or atherosclerosis. Hypertension, high LDL cholesterol, and high total cholesterol are major risk factors in heart disease and stroke as well. We know that rates of hypertension and high cholesterol increase with obesity, more so than those who are at a healthy weight. So it is important to achieve an ideal body weight, if at all possible. So we'll be talking about that primarily tonight. And about just under half of adults at this point have high blood pressure, which is a staggering number. And this affects different ethnicities at different rates. And more adults over the age of 50 than adults 40 to 60 have hypertension. Almost 4% of children have hypertension. And then you have a few more facts here, one of which being women are affected more so than men with high cholesterol. So these are staggering numbers. It's important to know the current situation with where Americans sit with our risk for cardiovascular disease. So it's important to touch on diabetes as well as another risk factor for heart disease, and that is diabetes. Predominantly type 2 is what we talk about that we have an effect on with our lifestyle modification. So at this point, about 11% of Americans have type 1 or 2 diabetes. A greater proportion of that number is type 2 diabetics. About 35% of us have pre-diabetes in this country. The age 65 and greater have the highest rate compared to other age groups, which is important to note. And about 90% of adults with diabetes are overweight or are obese, which is important to connect the dots. And again, you can continue to read here, and it affects different people of different ages. So if you read through the bottom here, almost 10% of women develop gestational diabetes during pregnancy, which is interesting as well. And those women do have an increased risk for developing type 2 diabetes later on in life, unfortunately. So that's a recap of risk for diabetes. And so lifestyle management for both heart disease and diabetes are very similar. But again, we're focusing on heart health tonight. So what I tend to focus on is our dietary patterns. So the most recommended at this point is the TLC diet, which is the Therapeutic Lifestyle Changes Diet, the American Heart Association recommendations, the DASH diet, or the Mediterranean diet. And DASH stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. So we'll go through each of these individually. There is quite a bit of overlap between them. And if you have any questions, we'll certainly address those at the end of the presentation tonight. So again, I alluded to the fact that weight loss is important to achieve if needed. So again, getting in that ideal body weight range, there's no exact number for everybody to achieve, but that number is individualized to you, and it is a range. Portion control foods is important. So we can overeat on the healthiest of foods and still have a difficult time maintaining our weight. We may even gain our weight on the foods that we should be eating. So portion control to have the appropriate amount of calories is important. And then moderate highly processed and sugar-laden food and drink for multiple reasons. They are overly processed foods. They're typically void of nutrition. They displace more nutritious foods in the diet. So again, we try to moderate those types of treats and sweets in the diet. Exercise as tolerated, so getting physician clearance and approval to do so, and then progressing as tolerated, but of course we'll touch on that in a few slides later on in the presentation. Doing something just as simple as increasing your fiber intake. So if you do nothing else than just focus on cleaning up the diet, improving the diet by increasing to 25 to 35 grams a day is going to make the quality of your diet so much better. So how do we do that? That's more plant-based foods, fruits, vegetables, grains, plant-based proteins like beans, legumes are all important and easy ways to increase the fiber. So again, getting more color on your plate throughout the day is a great way to increase your fiber. You'll see that theme throughout the presentation tonight as well. And then a big conversation with heart health is fats. And it's been controversial at times, but at this point in time, we are saying not to be afraid of fats, but to replace those saturated and trans fats with those unsaturated foods, especially the omega-3 fatty acids. And we'll talk about which foods are in each of those categories, what we should consume more of, as well as what to consume less of. And the last two tips here would be to add fruits and vegetables for antioxidants, to increase the nutritional density of your food, again, to improve on the quality of the diet. And the last one here is alcohol in moderation if you do drink, but if you're not currently a drinker, we don't recommend to start drinking. So we'll talk about moderation as well as we progress here. So those are some of the bullet points that we'll touch on in more description here, more detail. So some other modifiable risk factors to include would be tobacco use. We know that reducing tobacco use and smoking cessation is important for reducing our risk factors for heart disease. Physical inactivity is a huge one. So if you can incorporate small amounts of movement throughout your day, there will be a cumulative effect that will benefit you. So it doesn't have to be a large chunk of time where you have to change your clothes and you have to sweat and then you have to take a shower. So it's being more active throughout your day, parking further away from the grocery store, using the stairs, taking your time to do that, finding a walking buddy or an exercise buddy to stay accountable. So there's more tips and tricks too that we'll talk about for physical activity. So if you can stand more, move more, you're going to be in better shape because of that. And then poor diet, we'll talk about that predominantly tonight. So we'll move on from that. And then stress. We don't want to discount this topic here. Stress has an effect on so many parts of the body, mentally, physically. It has an effect on not just your blood pressure and the way your heart works, but also your gut health and inflammation throughout the body. As well as your outlook on life and how you're able to really get through any kind of stressful situations. So it's important to work on stress if that seems to be a factor in your life that has increased and you haven't put much time and attention into addressing that. So that's another one that we don't always get to, but that certainly is an important factor as well. So we'll get right into the diet here, and there are quite a few slides here, again, with much overlap. So we'll talk about the American Heart Association and their dietary recommendations, which is pretty much what the therapeutic lifestyle changes diet is. But the THC diet does offer a little bit more recommendations as far as exercise, recommending at least 30 minutes of movement a day. And sometimes just using the word movement is less intimidating than the word exercise or structured exercise or sustained exercise. So just moving more and sitting less, starting with that 30-minute period or time amount a day. So getting back to the American Heart Association recommendations. So again, we're trying to reduce our LDL cholesterol levels. And these are a few ways that we can do that. So again, we're trying to reduce the amount of saturated and trans fat and then replacing that with the unsaturated fats. So saturated fat predominantly comes from animal-based proteins in foods in general. So that would be from butter, lard, red meats, processed meats, but it also does come from from plant-based foods too, like the tropical oils and the coconut oils and things of that nature too. So we want to make sure that we don't overdo these. We're intentional about how much we eat in these categories. And then we get to the trans fat. So if you're not familiar with trans fat, we know it's been a topic that we've tried to reduce in the food supply in general. So we don't have to work so hard at reducing it ourselves. But what it was is we would take fats that were liquid at room temperature, we would hydrogenate them, which is forcing hydrogen atoms into them, so that that liquid fat is then solid at room temperature. It would increase the quality, the lifespan of that food on the shelf at the grocery store. So companies were willing to put more trans fats in their diet because it helped with the product staying good for longer. What it was not good for was our hearts and our overall health and wellness. So what the trans fats would do in our body is it would unfortunately increase our LDL levels. And again, those are the ones that we consider more lousy, that we want to reduce more of the time. And it would also decrease our HDL levels. So it would increase our LDL and it would decrease our HDL, which would certainly not improve our cholesterol ratio. It would do the exact opposite of what we're looking for. So it would further increase our risk for heart disease. So we want to make sure that we're reducing any or eliminating any trans fats that we might still have lingering in our diet. But again, because it's not in a whole lot of our foods, thinking of shortenings and baked goods and things of that nature. They're not as prominent at this point anymore, thankfully. So then we talk about the appropriate amount and quality of the calories. So it's the right portions and the right quality of the foods. And we'll be talking about that in different ways so that we see it from different perspectives, what that looks like on our plate, what that looks like when we're grocery shopping for these foods. So we'll talk about that more. We want to follow diet therapy for any other diseases we might have or any conditions like diabetes, celiac disease, anything else that might be important to include as well. So again, they do emphasize the fruit and vegetables, legumes, whole grains, fish and seafood, nuts, seeds, oils, those more liquid and darker at room temperature, and low-fat dairy in the mix too. So their stance is to limit our intake of red meats and processed meats. So those processed meats would be things like kielbasa and hot dogs and some of the Italian cold cuts, those types of things. And then the last two tips here from the American Heart Association would be reduce intake of sweets, especially sugar-sweetened beverages, and then achieving a DASH diet or the USDA MyPlate food pattern for other ways to see how this could shake out on your plate. And we'll look at those in detail as well. But this is a nice visual from the USDA, and it's looking at saturated fat in our diet and where we find it. So if you're finding that you are intaking too much saturated fat, these might be some of the sources that you can work on and tweak in your diet. So looking at the greatest numbers here, so 19% hits you here as sandwiches. So saturated fat predominantly comes in, again, the animal-based foods. So that's coming from the roast beefs and the meats and the pastrami and salami, and also the cheese and also the mayonnaise and other condiments that we're adding to our sandwich. So it can really layer up and stack up in our sandwiches. So if you do sandwiches, it's definitely time to give those an audit to see how you're doing. There's some great swaps that you can do to reduce the saturated fat. And then next to that is another bubble with 11% of desserts and sweet snacks. So again, croissants, muffins, they can all have a huge amount of not only saturated fat, but refined processed flours, sugar, and also sodium. So a lot of those baked goods can be like a triple whammy. So you want to make sure that those are in fact treats and not everyday foods, because that would increase your risk for heart disease. And then some other big numbers here. I see the rice, pasta, and grain-based mixed dishes, the dairy in there. So if you are doing dairy, reduced fat is always recommended. I see some poultry in there, so removing the skin. Different ways to cook these foods could also reduce the saturated fat. Grilling such would be advantageous over, say, sauteing in a frying pan where the fat stays in the food oftentimes. So this is a great visual. We have another one coming up that is very similar to it, and that is touching on sodium. So it looks very similar to the last slide, similar bubbles here, except we have sandwiches here is up higher than the saturated fat slide. So we're up at 21% of our sodium coming from sandwiches. And of course, if you've ever looked at any of the food labels that come from the deli at the grocery store, you will see that all of the meats and all of the meat-based salads like tuna fish, chicken salad, ham salad can all have a huge amount of sodium. And then you put that meat with the cheese and the condiments, and the bread itself can have a huge amount of sodium. So even having a half of a sandwich is a great way to start reducing your sodium and your saturated fat to intaking a more moderated amount. Same things here, you've got the rice pasta dishes, hoping that more of these are whole grain than the white processed varieties to give you the fiber that your body needs. So this is all very similar. So improving some of the food choices in these bubbles or reducing the portion size are two great tips to improving on the overall quality of your diet. So looking at the Mediterranean diet, which has really been recommended for quite some time. And if you take a look here, the bottom is not food specific at all. It's activity, it's socializing. And when you are dining, it's eating and sitting at the table with others around you and enjoying the experience with those around you. And then above that, we have wholesome, whole foods. You have what we call brown bread with kids when we're starting early education, but it's whole grain, high fiber bread. We have fruits, vegetables. You see some avocado in there, some potato with the skin, not in the French fried form that we have it here in our country. We have some heart-healthy oils in there. We see some herbs in the back there. Rather than just salting our food, we can provide flavor with that approach. And then above that, we have some seafood and fish. So we have some unsaturated sources of fats there in the omega-3s. And the fish that are not terribly high in fat, we call those lean sources of protein, like the shrimp. It does have some cholesterol in it, but we're finding that the food with its own cholesterol does not directly relate to our blood cholesterol. It's more related to, say, the saturated fat in that food, which is low in shrimp. So we can have some shrimp in moderation, assuming there's no food allergies. And then above that category, we have the poultry, egg, cheese, and yogurt. Again, skinless and moderated amounts of this in combination with other wholesome foods lower on the pyramid here. And then at the very top is the meats and sweets. So those are essentially treats that we have less often. And again, if you have these foods every day, they're not necessarily a treat anymore. They're just a common food as a foundational food in your diet. So we want to try to reduce the frequency of some of those sweets at the top. There's wine on the side there in moderation if consumed at all. And plenty of water to stay hydrated throughout the day. Because we know that if we're not drinking enough water, the body cannot function optimally. And sometimes we think we're hungry when we're just thirsty. So it's important to stay ahead of that thirst curve. And if you were to flip this pyramid upside down, that would look much like the standard Americanized diet that many Americans consume in our country, unfortunately. The vegetables are at the top, and then we'd have more meats and protein and sweets, sugar sweetened foods and beverages. So this is flipped from what we're used to in our country. So the goal is really to flip the standard American diet to reflect more of this pattern. So another way to look at this is in the plate form, and this is how it could shake out. There is some protein in here in the form of fish, salmon in the bottom right. So you get a nice, bold, orange colored fish, high in unsaturated fats. Above that, you have some whole grains or some beans, pulses, very high in fiber, complex fiber. So if somebody does have diabetes, it very slowly rises their blood sugars rather than the white pastas and breads and things of that nature. It's in an appropriate amount, about a quarter of the plate, which you'll see as a theme throughout the presentation. And on the left side, you see up to half the plate as produce, multiple colors, lots of leafy, colorful food, leafy colored greens in there. And it looks like the salad dressing, if any's even on there, has just fallen or seeped between the leaves. So it's not one of those goopy, high-fat dressings that just sits on top of the lettuce. So it's more of an oil-based dressing with maybe some vinegar, which is definitely preferred over the alternative. Off to the side, you don't necessarily have to have fruit with every meal, but they squeeze it in as almost like a sweet treat to have after a meal to kind of cleanse the palate as well. And they're having water alongside with the meal to help nourish and hydrate. So this is a very colorful, attractive plate. It does take some time and attention to prepare this, but once you get in the routine, it's easier to stay in the routine. So that's one way to look at how the Mediterranean diet looks on your plate. And it really does tout the monounsaturated fats. So again, I mentioned that they're liquid at room temperature and they're solid when chilled. They're known to lower the LDL levels, which we're looking to do when consumed in moderation. So we know if we're eating lots of guacamole and avocado and nuts and trail mix, we can easily tip the scale by eating too many calories. But if we eat portion controlled amounts of these foods, it can be heart healthy. It can be very sustaining, helps with satiety. And again, some great colorful hearty foods in here as well. A lot of these fats are high in vitamin E, which is an antioxidant, which is good for many processes in the body. And we typically find these fats in, again, those oils that are a little bit darker in color, the olive oil, peanut, canola oil, the avocados, nut butters, flax seeds. Try to get those in the milled or the meal form. And nuts such as walnuts and seeds such as sesame seeds. So there's lots of options, and there's more foods in addition to this list that you may already include in the diet. So you want to make sure to continue to include them in the right amounts. So a controversial topic is the polyunsaturated fats, because we have under that umbrella term is the omega-3s and the omega-6s. So it really splits below that term of polyunsaturated. So one we want to consume more of, and one we probably consume too much of in our standard American diet, and we need to reduce. So ideally we have a 1-to-1 ratio of this in our diet, which is not usually attainable. So it's more like a 1-to-3 ratio of the omega-3s to the omega-6s. So if you take a look at this chart here, the omega-3 touts many healthful benefits, everything from brain health to gut health, joint function, reduces risk of cancer, heart disease, diabetes. And the big one for me here is reducing inflammation, because inflammation tends to be really the core of many chronic conditions in our bodies. So if we can cool that inflammation in the body, we can then reduce our risk from many conditions. So anti-inflammatory foods are really popular for that reason with that approach. On the flip side, the omega-6s do typically the opposite. They do have some benefits, but the big one here at the end is that it can increase inflammation. So where do we get that in the body? The omega-6s are in a lot of our snack foods, a lot of bagged and boxed foods, things made with vegetable oils like chips and snacks, maybe some roasted nuts if they're not roasted with a great type of oil, grain-fed meats. So we typically get enough of those foods in our diet rather than the colorful, more nutritious omega-3s that you see listed here in the top right of the chart here. So this is really an important point to hone in on as well. Not all polyunsaturated fats are created equally, but you want to shift to those more with the omega-3s rather than the omega-6s. And you see some more sources at the bottom here that are rich in the omega-3 foods. So that brings us to the DASH diet. And again, that stands for the Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. And the studies do show that there is a decrease in blood pressure when we consume diets, again, fat, saturated, low in the saturated fat, cholesterol, total fat. If it focuses on the wholesome fruits, vegetables, and low-fat dairy products, but reduced amounts of red meats, sweets, and added sugars, and rich in the nutrients potassium, calcium, and fiber. So you get a lot of potassium in the fruits and vegetables section of the grocery store. Calcium we do get from the reduced fat dairy, but also from our leafy greens. Our kale, our baby spinach, our collard greens all have a great amount of calcium. And then fiber. Fiber you only get from plant-based foods. You never get from the animal-based foods. So keep that in mind too. Always rounding out your meals with plants. So some dietary factors here. We've been through most of these, but we haven't hit on all of them in detail. But research is currently showing that dietary cholesterol is not our first concern at this point. Again, the cholesterol in our food does not directly correlate to our blood cholesterol, such as the example with the shrimp. So we're not necessarily restricting that for the common population. We want to keep it within range because a lot of the foods that are high in cholesterol happen to be high in saturated fat as well, and that's typically where the problem lies. Fiber, again, including that 25 to 35 grams a day, it's associated with lower incidence of heart disease. Antioxidants are typically in our colorful foods, but not always. We do get some antioxidants in our coffee, in our dark chocolate, in our cruciferous vegetables, our cauliflower. So again, not all of our most colorful foods, but we want to eat a rainbow of color to hit on all of the different classes of antioxidants that can benefit you. And then there's stanols and sterols. They're known to reduce cholesterol by blocking absorption, and those are typically supplemented in our foods, such as margarines. So you'll see that there. The omega-3, which we just talked about, helps reduce the cardiovascular risk, and also may affect our triglyceride levels. So we want to make sure that those are not over and above the recommended levels. And they may raise HDL levels, which we know is another added benefit. And we do know that our body weight is associated with increased risk, and there are specific guidelines from both the American Heart Association and other associations to reduce our body weight into, again, that ideal body weight range. And the last tip here is just that the longer that we are overweight or obese in our lives, it increases our risk to developing any kind of cardiovascular disease too. So it is important to work on that, and it doesn't have to all be fixed and figured out immediately, but making steps in the right direction, small steps, can also reduce our risk or risk for heart disease as well. So anything that you can do is only going to improve your situation. So medical nutrition therapy is just the fancy term that dietitians use for treating a condition with your diet, the fuel for your body. So we talked about the DASH diet. Weight management is important. We talk a lot about calories in versus calories out and finding the balance for the individual, and that balance looks different for different people. So that's an individual conversation that you'll want to have with your doctor, or health professional, or a dietitian. Again, we talked about alcohol in moderation, if at all. Physical activity, doing what you can and progressing from there is so important. Looking at what you are able to do today and then building on that slowly. The omega-3 fats versus the monounsaturated fats, and those were the ones predominantly high in avocados and walnuts and things of that nature too. So those are the ones we're looking for mostly, and less of the saturated fats and the trans fats that we talked about as well. So we looked at the visual that had the sodium intake with the different bubbles here. So what do those numbers mean? How much sodium should we be taking in? The American Heart Association recommends 2,400 milligrams a day. So what does that look like? On a spoon, it would look like 1 teaspoon of salt. But you could never pick up a salt shaker ever again and still go above and beyond this recommendation on a daily basis. A lot of our foods are processed and have sodium packaged right up in it, so you never have to use salt to get sodium in your diet. So the US dietary recommendations are less than 23, so similar to the American Heart Association. But very important to note here is those currently with hypertension or those with a high risk for certain cardiovascular disease may need to reduce to 1,500 milligrams a day. So what does that factor, what does that look like in your diet? So if you're consuming 3 square meals a day and you have a similar size meal each time, you're looking at about 500 milligrams per meal. That would not account for drinks or snacks or desserts outside of that, but that's a good number to shoot for when you're trying to cap sodium at your meals. So if you do have food labels and are reading them, it is important to make sure that you're tallying those foods that are making up your meal to make sure you're not going above and beyond. And if the foods do not have the food labels, that's typically good news with our fruits and vegetables and some other things too that don't necessarily have much for sodium at all. DASH diet, 1,500 milligrams as well, in agreement with US dietary guidelines with those with hypertension. So that is how that shakes out, what those numbers look like. So every 5 years, the USDA updates their dietary guidelines, and we're just into this new phase, 2020 to 2025. And these are their loose guidelines here, some recommendations of following a healthy eating pattern throughout the lifespan. All food and drink beverages matter. Food choices and beverage choices matter. Focus on variety, nutrient density and amount. Limiting calories from added sugars, saturated fats, reducing sodium in the diet. So again, lots of overlap here that we're seeing from all different points of view. Shifting to healthier food and beverage choice. Healthy patterns for all, at home, school, work. So making it a part of your regimen, what you do on the daily basis rather than going on a diet, going off a diet. Going on a diet just presumes that the diet will end at some point. So if you just make these changes that you can live with and that you can enjoy, are going to make all the difference. So here's another way that the USDA recommends to portion your plate. And you've seen this before with the Mediterranean diet. It is a quarter of your plate protein, and that could be animal-based, like chicken and fish, or it could be plant-based with the chickpeas, legumes, lentils, those types of things. Grains is above that, a quarter of our plate whole grain, which we know pastas and rices can really stretch beyond that quarter of our plate. So trying to pull back on those portions and to make whole grains so that they are filled with antioxidants and fiber and vitamins and minerals rather than the white counterparts that do not have much of that. And then on the other side of the plate, again, the fruits and vegetables. Fruits we're recommending at about 2 to 3 servings a day. Vegetables are about 3 to 5 servings a day. A serving looks like a half cup or so if you were measuring. You don't necessarily have to. It's nice just to eyeball the plate as being half fruits and veggies. Trying to keep the skins whenever possible, which is why an orange is more healthful and nutritious than a cup of orange juice. You get all that fiber and all that pulp and all the good stuff that you want from the orange in the wholesome orange itself. And then off the plate is dairy, which can be consumed on the plate, but they remind people to drink milk or calcium, vitamin D fortified dairy alternative if they are. And those are the 5 food groups, but that's why having the conversation with the oils is so important too, because it's not fit necessarily into its own food group here in the current visual. That's why we try and spend so much time talking on fats, type of fats, how much fat over the course of the day is important. So that's one visual. And this is another way to look at it. It's the same thing I just said. Again, what portions of the plate would make up, would constitute each food group. And again, at the bottom, limiting the added sugars, the saturated fat, again, from predominantly the animal-based foods, and the sodium. So if something is packaged, bagged, boxed, it has a long shelf life, it's important to look specifically at those food labels to see what the sodium content is. And I think we touched on everything there. So this is, again, for your reference. I don't need to go into all of this in detail. You can print this out from your computer if you're able to, or we have printout copies here that we can distribute with a drive-by pickup or drive-through pickup. But it's nice to see these recommendations of what goes where and what a serving is. And what I didn't touch on, and I'm sure this question has come up with somebody, is what a serving size of a grain is. And that is typically always 1 ounce. And that is a measured or weighed ounce. So an ounce of granola is going to be usually around 1/4 or 1/3 of a cup, but an ounce of puffed rice is about 1 cup to 1 1/4 cups. But both provide similar calories and that sort of thing. So it's important to look at our grains in particular. Is it 1 slice of hearty, thick bread as 1 ounce, or is it 3 slices of the Weight Watchers brand bread? That equals 1 ounce. So take a look at what the label reads. That'll give you a better idea of what the serving size looks like. Oh, and there's dairy on the top there, the reduced fat, less sweetened versions of dairy, if at all possible. So this is another way that could be confusing, how you're going to fit all of that in your day more of the time, and it could look like this. Again, the 2 to 3 servings of dairy. Breakfast is an easy place to include dairy. Cheese stick could be included with a piece of fruit at lunch, and you could have a cup of milk with your afternoon snack before dinner. Fruits, again, a 1/2 cup each is going to amount to about 1.5 cups for this particular day. Vegetables can certainly be more, so let's just call each of those servings 1 cup. And you could easily get 3 cups of vegetables there and meet your dietary needs. The protein here could only be just a few ounces to meet your needs, depending on your gender and your activity needs. But this is how these ounces and these servings could be placed throughout the day so that it doesn't look overwhelming that you're eating and preparing food all day long. And you can certainly cut corners to make this happen. So it doesn't have to be intimidating. It's very possible. Again, it's just getting the information and making it part of your routine, making it a habit so that you have the foods that you need on hand and they're at your fingertips when you need them so that you're not reaching for the alternatives instead. So what we have here is the food label. And again, specifically for nutrients like sodium and the types of fat, it's so important to look at the label. And that has changed in a lot of our packaging at this point. So we have the old label on the left, and that's what we've seen for years now. And off to the right, we have the new proposed label that you see on a lot of packages at this point. So the major differences would be, starting at the top, the amount of servings per container is more bold. So especially for things like sugar sweetened beverages, like sodas, it may have said 2.5 servings previously, and now it might just say 1 because that's a more standard serving that people are consuming anyway. So people could have been looking at that serving before and thinking that was for the whole bottle, when now they know in bold, it reads that it is in fact 1 serving. So it's important to put that in perspective of what amount of food are you eating that totals these nutrients on the label here. So that's the first change. Serving size is below that, so we know again what we're looking at. And then the calories for the serving size are bolded with an increased size font here. So it's important to look at that. Not that we necessarily need anybody or you calorie counting, but it's important to know, is this a calorie dense food or is this a food that is not incredibly calorie dense? So it's important to have an idea of where that falls. You see the percentage of daily value move from the right side of the old label to the left side in the new label. And I wouldn't put too much focus on this, again, because all of our dietary needs are specific to our unique needs. And if somebody needs or is allotted 2,400 milligrams of sodium, and the next person is allotted 1,500 milligrams of sodium, your percent daily value will be much skewed from one person to the next. So I wouldn't put much focus on the percentage. I would put the focus on the raw numbers, the values off to the right side or in the middle of the new proposed label. So as you work your way down the label, we have total fat. And sometimes that's all it gives you, but more companies are actually teasing out what types of fats you're getting from your food. So saturated fat is a big one here. We want to know our animal-based foods, how much saturated fat is in them. And then trans fat, again, those are the two that we want to make sure we're not taking too much of in our diets. And the trans fat we'd like to eliminate if at all possible. Now, one interesting point here, you might say this, what example can we give? This cake frosting says that it's trans fat free on the front of the label. It might say that in big bold print. And then on the back side, it might still say trans fat, 0 grams. And then as you read through the ingredient listing, it will say hydrogenated oil of whatever type may be listed there. And that's your red flag to know that there is in fact trans fat in that food. So the issue there is if it has 0.5 grams or less per serving, it does not have to list it on the label. It does have to list it under the ingredient listings. So again, that kind of comes back to the serving size. If you're eating 2 or 3 or more servings of this food, such as cake frosting, you're probably not consuming 2 tablespoons of that on a slice of cake. You might have double, triple, quadruple that amount. So that 0.5 is then 2, 3, or 4 grams of saturated fat. And that can really add up. And if you're doing croissants and muffins and other baked goods too, there could be some hidden trans fats in those foods. So don't just look at the nutrition label. You can always look for those, the possibility of having trans fat in the ingredient listing. So making sure that you read through it just so that you're comfortable with the food choices that you're making. So what would be great is if it did list the polyunsaturated fat and the monounsaturated fat. And some nuts will do that for you so you can see the breakdown. Some oils may do that if it's predominantly just a fat based food. So I would like to see more of that. That's probably my pet peeve with a lot of these food ingredients. But it doesn't necessarily tell you what types of polyunsaturated fats are in there. Again, the omega-3 versus the omega-6, that's where, again, you need to go to the ingredient list and say, what kind of fats are used in this potato chip or these pretzels or whatever it may be? Is it a fat that you're more comfortable consuming or you prefer to reduce or eliminate? So that's where you'd find the information that's going to be more telling as to what types of fats are not listed on the nutrition fact label itself. So then below that, we get to cholesterol. And again, it's not where we need to be going first and foremost, but we can just take a look and see what that number looks like there. Again, it used to be like 200 or 300 milligrams was really the range that we're looking for. So we're not looking to go greater than that, of course, so we want to keep it within range. The sodium intake. So this is the big one here where I don't need you to be looking at the percent daily value, looking at the raw number to the right of that. So it's important to know how much is there. And again, you're tallying certain foods up and adding them up to see, am I staying somewhere in that 500 milligram mark for the meal? If you're trying to restrict or limit to 1,500 milligrams of sodium a day, or maybe you have a little bit more cushion there because you're consuming 2,400 milligrams of sodium a day. So maybe that's 700 milligrams per meal. So not much more above the 500 milligram. So it's good to be adding up the sodium in milligrams, making sure that you're only consuming 1 serving, or maybe it's 2, and then you're doubling this number so that you're in the ballpark of where you want to be. And of course, our diet waxes and wanes. It's not the same every day for most of us, but we want to try and stay in the ballpark, of course. Total carbs is more specific to our diabetic community, making sure that the types of carbs that we're consuming are the right quality, and then we're not overdoing them so that our blood sugars are not spiking. So the carb section is really specific to diabetics, and then also others that are just trying to reduce their extraneous calories. Maybe they're consuming too many snacks, and that's typically coming from the carbs in their diet. So it's good to look into this, but it's usually our diabetics that look there first and foremost. So whoever is reading this label, we want the quality of those carbs to be decent. So one way that can help with that is to look at the dietary fiber. So if we're looking at pasta, for example, we want to make sure that there is a decent amount of fiber in that pasta. And typically speaking, 5 grams of fiber is an excellent source of fiber in a food. 3 grams is a good source of fiber in that food. So if your cereal in the morning is 1 gram and your bread at lunch is 1 gram and your white rice at dinner time is 1 gram, it's very difficult to meet your fiber needs. Again, that 25 to 35 grams a day is that range that we're shooting for. So if you do the high fiber or the whole grain option, it's much easier to meet that need or meet that recommendation when we're doing the whole food, naturally higher fiber option, not necessarily the specialty foods that try to jack up the fiber intake with different food ingredients. So again, the fruits, the vegetables, the whole grains, the nuts and seeds do have a decent amount of fiber. The beans, lentils are a great source of fiber as well. So only plant-based foods will you find fiber. You'll never find them in animal-based foods. And sugar down below is one of my favorite changes to the dietary label here. And that is because they now have an added line here. So we don't have to just group sugars together that are added sugars and naturally containing sugars. That used to be all in one line. Now more of these companies are adding that second line for added sugars. So when you're looking at yogurts, for example, you may wonder, is there a lot of added sugar to this? And typically per cup, there's about 5 grams of lactose for that 5.3 ounce cup or so when you buy the individual cups at the grocery store. And usually the rest is added sugar. But now they'll actually tell you how much is added sugar from cane sugar or other types of ingredients, honey or whatever it is that they're adding for a calorie sweetener. If you're looking at the nutritive sweeteners like the stevia and the Splenda and those types, that of course won't be factored into this label. Again, that'll be under the ingredient listing so that you'll see again where the sweetness is coming from and if that's something that you're comfortable consuming or not. So I do like that added line of added sugars. And I think the only added tip there is how much sugar is too much sugar. It's important to know that every 4 grams of added sugar is a teaspoon of sugar. So it's nice to have that visual. So if your soda has 40 grams of sugar, divide that by 4 and that you'll then know that you're having 10 teaspoons of added sugar in that drink choice alone. And where does that fall in the recommendations? It's typically around 6 to 8 teaspoons per day for us. And where do you fall in that range? The more active, larger people are at the higher end, typically men. Pregnant women could be there. And then at the lower end of the range is typically women and children, and less active people would have just 6 teaspoons of added sugar a day. And that's not just from beverages, that's from food and drink combined. Why is that a problem? For this conversation, it's typically for the risk of inflammation and chronic inflammation in the body. And we, again, would like to cool that inflammation and not ramp it up with high intakes of sugar in the first place. So that's important to take a look at as well. We can reduce our risk with not just changing our fat intake, but also the types of carbs and sugar and reducing sugar as well. So I think that ends the conversation with diet. And then we move on for just a brief conversation with exercise. So there's so many benefits to exercise. And if we could package the benefits of exercise. In a pill, it would be the most prescribed medication in the world. There's mental benefits, there's physical benefits. There's so much that it brings to the table. But first and foremost, if you're not currently exercising, to get medical clearance from your physician first, and then finding a routine that works for you. Finding a professional can be helpful. Starting slow, again, finding a workout buddy to stay accountable and to ensure safety is important as well. And then you're exploring your options. There's so many ways to move your body now. And that might look different than what it did a few years ago. Not all gyms are operating the same way that they used to. We may not be doing the same busy 5Ks that we used to do too, but there's still so many options to move your body, and a lot of virtual options at home too, with streaming videos, being on YouTube, things that you can do at your home with limited equipment. So there's so many options at your fingertips at this point. And the two major categories are strength and conditioning and cardiovascular activity, which we'll touch upon as well. So I always get the question, what is the best thing that I can do for my general health and well-being? What's going to help with weight management the fastest? And usually the best answer for that is to do what you enjoy. Find something that speaks to you, that you like to do. It's not a chore. It's not something that you dread doing. It can be something that you enjoy with others, or you do for yourself in your own quiet time. It could be a combination of those things. So finding what works for you, hopefully on a daily basis, that can help balance out the calories in versus the calories out, to keep you motivated, to keep you seeing results and seeing changes in the blood work, and how you look and feel and perform on a daily basis are all some great ways to determine how your path is working out for you with your diet and exercise. So the next slide talks more specifically about how much of what for benefits here. So the physical activity guidelines for Americans are as follows. For important health benefits, we're looking at about 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity at work every week. And aerobic activity is focused just on that heart pumping activity. So walking, jogging, swimming, stair climbing, exercise classes are predominantly focused on the aerobic component. And 150 minutes a week looks like about 30 minutes a day. So that's what that would look like. With the addition of muscle strengthening activities 2 days a week, research is finding is the great recipe for exercise. So strength and conditioning or muscle strengthening activity, what could that include? That could be anything from strength training with weights, bands, machines. It could be using your own body weight versus gravity. So it may not be any equipment at all. So that could also open up the door for certain types of yoga and Pilates. There's so many types of ways now that you can get some muscle and strengthening or conditioning activities without even going to the gym. So there's lots of options for us there. So if you're one of those people that likes to be very efficient with your time and you're relatively fit to start, you could get the same benefits in less time if you are willing and able to ramp up the intensity of that exercise. So that breaks down to 75 minutes of vigorous, intense aerobic activity every week. So what would that look like? That would be like singles of tennis rather than doubles of tennis. That would be different sets of swimming in the pool. So timed or racing in the pool to get the laps in. So it wouldn't just be your leisurely activity. You would really have to be ramping up the heart rate there. And again, this is for those that have been exercising for some time to get to this level of conditioning. And then we also add on the muscle strengthening activities twice a week as well. So those are for important health benefits, and they note for even greater health benefits. If you've been at it for a while and you can increase from there, is 300 minutes of the moderate activity a week. That's aerobic activity, again, with the 2 days of strength training. Or again, reducing that time and being more efficient and effective by increasing the intensity of that exercise, again, with some intentional strength training activity in the mix as well. So what it comes down to is what your ability and interest level is, what you're able to do, how much time you can afford to this, and then building slowly on that foundation of how you can grow your repertoire of exercise. So that's what that looks like. And there's so many other things that could be fit in there as well. And again, it's moving more, it's sitting less, it's building on what you're currently doing and moving in the right direction. It's progression, it's not about perfection. If you miss a day, then you just get back on the wagon and you move forward from there. So that is the topic of exercise. And if anyone has any questions, you can chime in just a few minutes. But we conclude here, and really what it comes down to is balancing what you eat and do. We want to make sure we fuel ourselves appropriately so that we feel well, we perform well, and we are well and healthy. That's really what it comes down to. So we need to be intentional about the quality and the quantity of the food and drink. So how much and what types of the food that we eat and drink. And that really sets the stage for our dietary pattern. And again, we're looking to improve on that and find what works for us. That's not a diet that we want to go on and go off and back and forth, but finding a lifestyle that works for you and not something that is just short term and a quick fix that you would revert back to anyway. Most importantly, when you're sitting down and looking at your foods, again, looking for the major food groups in there, finding some color on your plate. If you're finding that your diet is void of color and you just have a brown sandwich with some French fries, and maybe the ketchup is the only colorful food on your plate, then everybody has some work and some opportunities to grow and improve their diet too. So looking at, again, what you're currently at and moving forward. So it's important to sit down and map out some goals for both diet, exercise, maybe stress relief, and find ways to improve that, and then set those specific and intentional goals to improving in those areas. And then seeking additional support as needed. So if you need help setting those goals, determining what areas need improvement, what areas that you can work on that is going to allow you to reap the benefit, it's important to seek out that support with your doctor, your dietitian, even personal trainers and those health professionals that are educated in those areas that can help you safely set those goals is so important too. Finding a support network as well is important so that you're not going through this alone. Soliciting help from your spouse, family, children. The more people that you let know that you're trying to improve on your diet and your lifestyle, the more support you will receive. And they can't support you unless they know. So those are the major tips I have for you today. We can open it up for some questions before Jenny comes up here and has some final information to relay to you. So do we stop the slides from there?